Okay, good morning all. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to this wonderful session. Today, we are celebrating the World Ocean Day prior to the actual. Okay, good morning all. First of all, I would like. Sorry for the disturbance. Today, we are celebrating the World Ocean Day. Actually, it is one day prior to the actual date, which is on 8th June 2022, as we did in the last year. That was our beginning of our monthly webinar series. In the beginning, I would like to say a few words about our activities of the OSI Pune chapter. The Indian Ocean Society of India, in short we are called it is OSI. It is a society of professionals that has like members from different fraternities all over India with 5 local chapters. So one of the local chapter is the Pune OSI. So it has started functioning from May 2013 onwards with various activities. The main intention of this society is to share the knowledge and experience among the individuals, institutions, and industries working in the ocean science, in addition to the empowering the ocean communities to sustainably use the ocean and its resources. It is also intended for knowledge dissemination through monthly webinars, basic knowledge programs, and awareness campaigns, etc. As an innovative step, this chapter has introduced a quarterly newsletter of Ocean Society of India Pune chapter, which was named as Ocean Digest, and its first copy was released in April 2014 under the editorial leadership of Dr. Ashok Karamuri. Now he is a professor at Hyderabad Central University. Now this newsletter is promptly being published by main OSI committee. In between, I would like to remind you to follow and subscribe at OSI Pune chapter on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Now coming to today's theme of World Ocean Day 2022, the theme is Revitalization, Collective Action for the Ocean. It is a part of UN Decade of the Ocean Sciences, since the UN declared the decade 2021 to 2030 as the Decade of the Oceans. From this theme itself, it is clear that rejuvenation is essential to the ocean that demands collective action. As long as humanity exists, we are dependent on the ocean for sustenance, transportation, and also for survival. The ocean occupies about 70% or more than 70% of the planet, and it acts as a source of protein for more than 1 billion people around the world. The ocean supplies 50% of the planet's oxygen, and it absorbs about 30% of the carbon dioxide, and thus it regulates climate. Therefore, the marine environment is a vital resource for our life on Earth. But over time, our relationship with the sea has grown increasingly demanding. Humanity's progress has led to mounting pressure on the effect on the ocean becomes more and more pronounced. Thus, climate change is a menace to the present and future day populations, and thus the primary association with the warming of the global oceans. In general, the sea surface temperature increasing heterogeneously over the globe oceans. But in the Indian Ocean, the rate of warming, which is much higher than, or almost 35% more than that of the global tropical average. Therefore, it will cause marine heat waves, and it leads to depletion of marine population and also bleaching of corals. It is unfortunate that the reduction of the pelagic and benthic fish populations due to various reasons such as global warming, overexploitation of fishes, and the dumping of microplastics into the ocean. So we are taking more from the ocean than can be replenished, and we are putting back the polluting agents beyond their absorption level. We can see the reality of what we have done to the ocean, and now its existence is at tipping point. Therefore, we need to work together to create a balance between the ocean that no longer depletes its bounty, but instead restores its vibrancy and brings it to a new life. We must build a connection to the ocean that is inclusive, innovative, and informed by lessons from the past. Even though all its benefit, the ocean is now need our support, and therefore we should act collectively to rejuvenate the oceans. With these few words, I would like to conclude, and I would like to hand over the mic to Supriya Chakrabarti, our chairman of OSI Pune chapter, to introduce our speaker, and he will say something about him. Thank you. So, Supriya.
Okay, thank you very much, Supriyaji. Let me see if I can share my screen. If you can let me know that it looks okay. Is everyone able to see my screen? Yeah?
Yes, yes.
All right, okay. Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to just start off by thanking Supriyaji as well as the Ocean Society of India for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure to share some of my science and research with all of you. And so today, my talk is going to be about how we can understand paleo-oceanographic changes, so things that happen in the ocean across geological history, how we can use that information and really learn some lessons about how the Earth's climate system works, and apply those lessons to try and understand the type of future that we're headed into. So today in particular, I'm going to be talking a little bit about both climate simulations that we use to try and project future and past climate change by feeding in the boundary conditions. But at the same time, I'm also going to talk about generating actual paleoclimate data and paleoceanographic data to try and understand what happened to the oceans across Earth history. And the tool that I'm going to be sort of focusing on for today, we can use a variety of tools for this endeavor, is going to be microfossils, and particularly using planktic foraminifera, which are a particular type of microfossil. So I'm going to get through all of these topics today. If anyone has questions, I'm happy to field them. As if you want, you can interrupt me for if you don't understand something, or I'm happy to receive questions at the end as well. So
Dr.
I'd like to start off. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Actually, we got a feed from YouTube saying that your voice is not audible. So we are just waiting for some input to see if you are audible now. So could you just wait for like maybe 10 to 20 seconds, and we'll see from our viewers if it is audible at all.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, okay. Just give us 20 seconds.
Yep.
Yes, you're audible. You may go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So let me start this talk by giving a token of immense appreciation to the International Ocean Discovery Program, or the IODP. This is an intergovernmental endeavor from nations across the globe, including India. India is a key member of IODP. And essentially, the research that I'm going to talk about today stems from samples largely taken by this drilling vessel, as well as samples facilitated by the IODP. Okay, and I'd also like to thank my co-authors on this. As you can see, it's a pretty diverse set. I'd like to highlight in particular my students' contribution, Serena Conde here at the University of Arizona. And also these IODP expeditions, take a whole entire village of 30 people across various sort of subdisciplines and disciplines to really come together in order to generate these paleoceanographic records. So I'd like to thank all of the scientists who sailed with me as well. Okay, with that done, let's get into the talk today. So one of the overarching motivations for my talk comes from this graphic right here. And many of you have probably seen this, but if you've not, this is a pretty staggering graphic the first time I saw it. But basically, there are more people that live inside this circle than outside of it. Okay, so essentially, we can see that in sort of the tropical Indian Ocean realm, along with India and East Asia, that's where the majority of the population lives. And these are still largely countries that depend quite heavily on agriculture and agrarian-based sort of economy. And considering this, these are locations where the interactions with climate variability and climate change and extreme weather events can be really impactful on a much more direct case than in several other places. So the motivation is to try and understand and help constrain what the climate of this region is headed to in the future. Okay, and in particular, obviously, we all know that these are regions where the climatic phenomenon known as the monsoons are at play here. They're extremely important. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir here. All of you are well aware of this, but essentially the climatic phenomenon of the monsoon, that word, the etymology stems from Mossam. And as you can see here, here's a map from the Portuguese in the 17th century. And essentially, they knew very well, they borrowed the term from the Arab soldiers and Arab merchants. But basically, there is a seasonal reversal of the winds, and they knew exactly when to hop on the winds and take advantage of this and to basically go into these trade routes. And on the flip side, during the winter time, basically the post-monsoon period, you have the winter monsoon or the reversal of this sea breeze and this large-scale seasonal sea breeze. And essentially, you had basically people exploit this knowledge to try and make seafaring a little bit easier. Now, of course, it's not even though the name, sort of the etymology derives from here, the monsoon is no stranger to us Indians. We've kind of built our entire civilization and our societies intertwined with the monsoon since prehistory. And so here's just an example of sort of descriptions and depictions of the monsoon in our sort of epics, in Indian epics and so on. So this said, I just wanted to sort of show that there's a very sort of tight coupling between the climatic phenomenon that I'm going to be talking about and sort of the culture and society and the civilization in this region as well. Okay. Now, that said, sort of in a more impactful nature, there are sort of intense variabilities of the monsoon. And one particular type of variability is year-to-year droughts and floods. So you hear some examples of some extreme events associated with the monsoon, Indian monsoon recently, the Indian summer monsoon. And here's just another example showing you that there is a tight coupling between the amount of rainfall that the summer monsoon brings and the agricultural production in India. Okay, so now I've been talking about the monsoon, and clearly the impacts are surrounding sort of hydrology and hydroclimate. But so far, I've just introduced the monsoon as winds. But essentially, the monsoon is really impactful when it comes to the rainfall that it brings. So the monsoon rainfall. So on the left-hand side here, I have an animation of sort of the climatology of rainfall in the Indian Ocean and sort of South Asian sector here. And essentially, you can see the sort of the seasonal march of the Indian monsoon as it sort of envelops the subcontinent during the summer months of June to September. And then you can see that it recedes during the October phase and basically comes back down. I'd like to point out here, this is a slide that I show my American friends here, just how immense this climatic phenomenon is. And so this is an equal area projection of India on top of the United States with Bangalore, which is my home city, sort of centered on where Tucson, where I currently live, is. And essentially, this is describing a weather phenomenon or seasonal climatic phenomenon that is affecting parts from equivalent to Mexico and Sonora right here, all the way up to Canada. Just showing you how geographically broad the system is. And that said, of course, the impacts of the monsoon are immense, as I've shown you, not only to society, but also climatically as well. And we need to get a handle on how the monsoon is going to change under future global warming. So due to anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, the globe is warming right now. And here are some projections from several different climate models, because again, the climate models are the best tools we have to try and understand where we're headed to into the future from a quantitative sense. And so this shows you the multi-model ensemble mean. So a lot of an average of a bunch of different models, climate models over the historical period, and different projections under different regimes of how much CO2 we are eventually going to emit over the next couple of centuries. And as you can see in this sort of worst case scenario, as well as the others, there's a large spread in terms of where that might actually go in terms of the global surface temperature average. So that said, we know the globe is going to warm, but what is less clear is how that's going to impact systems such as the Indian monsoon, for example. Now, that said, the latest, greatest comparison of models, so-called CMIP-6 models, this is from a paper published last year, pretty much unanimously says that in the future, under global warming, the Indian monsoon response is going to be pretty robust, meaning that there's multi-model agreement, and that the variability as well as the amount of the monsoon seasonality is going to increase. So you can see that there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of the spatial patterns, but across the board, pretty much the net is, the models are simulating that there's going to be an increase in the amount of rainfall. Now, one thing to keep in mind here, of course, I'm giving a talk in an ocean society seminar space here, but I've been only talking about atmospheric phenomenon, about the monsoon and rainfall and the winds. But obviously, the monsoon does not happen in isolation. So the monsoon has a pretty outsized impact on what happens to the adjacent oceans. So what I have here on the right-hand side is an animation of the monthly salinity, the climatological salinity in the Indian Ocean. And what I'd like for you to observe is that during the summer months of the monsoon, you essentially have rainfall all over the subcontinent. And then during October is when you have this sort of really strong plume of fresh water that's eventually draining all of this rainfall from the rivers into the Bay of Bengal. The monsoon also has a huge impact on the Arabian Sea. That's why the Arabian Sea is more saline, is because of the evaporation associated with the monsoon winds. And at the same time, that's where it also explains the fresher conditions in terms of the runoff into the Bay of Bengal at the surface layer right here. Okay, so this has a pretty large impact on the marine ecosystems in the Bay of Bengal. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the Bay of Bengal. There's a lot of work that has been done on the Arabian Sea and oceanic productivity and impacts on the monsoon, particularly in the paleoclimate realm. A little less so has been focused on in the Bay of Bengal. So we're going to zoom into this relatively fresh region because of the runoff of monsoon rainfall. And what I have here are two kind of little technical plots here, but if you bear with me, on the left-hand side, The star is basically going to be the site of the core where we drilled and where I'm going to be presenting all the results to you. But the contours here are basically depicting the depth of a particular layer in the ocean, in the water column of the ocean, known as the barrier layer. And essentially what this barrier layer is typically in the ocean, we think about the mixed layer in the open ocean, basically in terms of temperature, where the temperature is constant and the top layer is sort of well mixed by the winds. Now, in the Bay of Bengal, considering how much runoff comes in, you actually have a very fresh, so this blue line is salinity. All of these parameters are increasing towards the right. So you can see that the topmost layer is fresh compared to all of the underlying waters, and that's because of this runoff. So in fact, in the Bay of Bengal, as opposed to many other parts of the ocean, you have a mixed layer that is defined by salinity, actually. And the isothermal layer depth, or the depth where the temperature is consistent, is actually quite deeper than that overlying sort of shallow salinity layer. The difference between those is known as this barrier layer, which can essentially give rise to an inhibition of mixing. So it essentially stops mixing. And why that matters is that marine ecosystems in the upper part of the water column, they require nutrients. And typically these nutrients are either sourced through the rivers or they're sourced through the deep ocean, because the deep ocean is filled with nutrients. So here is a plot here showing the observations of the barrier layer, so how thick it is. So the darker green shows deeper barrier layers. You can see how it evolves seasonally, and you get the deepest barrier layers in the sort of the Northwest Bay of Bengal during October and November after the monsoon. And here are concurrent plots of production, how productive the ocean is, how many plankton are surviving, and basically how much carbon are they capturing in terms of producing biota. And there is a correlation here. And essentially what I'd just like for you to focus on right now is that the least amount of production tends to happen during the times when the barrier layer is thicker, inhibiting that mixing. So one of the causes through which you can get more production is by nutrients that are basically sent to the surface, either through eddy pumping, near shore or remote winds. And then on the flip side, you can have Ekman pumping or other types of ocean atmospheric processes that induce this barrier layer and can basically inhibit nutrients being sourced to the upper ocean. So why does this matter? I mean, this makes a difference because this region is already in a sort of a vulnerable state when it comes to things like fisheries. Believe it or not, Bangladesh and India combined are the second largest fishery after China. That is a pretty staggering fact that I learned. And this beats both Japan, US, and the Russia combined in terms of its contribution to the overall global fishery. And in particular, some of you may recognize this as the Hilsha fish. This is a pretty sort of popular proteinaceous diet for a lot of people on the coast. These fisheries are basically also located around the coast. And if we know that primary production, how healthy that productivity is directly coupled to those ecosystems as well as these catches as well. So we want to know how the monsoon is changing. We think it's going to increase. But ultimately, then what's going to be the impact on the marine ecosystems is a little less clear. So the models that I showed you before, they're basically physical models, and they didn't have necessarily biogeochemistry enabled in them. Or basically, you couldn't query those models, the ones that I showed you before, about how the ocean is changing. But this is a multi-model ensemble of the future projections. Here are the historical. These are two future projections under different boundary conditions of how much CO2. And you can see here, this is 1995 to 2014. This is 2080 to 2099. And essentially what we're seeing here on the top column is changes in the stratification, or how stratified the water column is, meaning less mixing. And at the bottom here is the net primary productivity. So essentially how productive those oceans are. And these two are telling us, the two on the right-hand side are telling us about the change in the future according to these models. The important thing to note here is that wherever you have the dots are depicting locations where all the models agree that the sign of change is the same. So this is where we have a lot of model agreement about stratification, and definitely in the sort of the worst case model emission scenario, there is a lot of agreement that it's going to lead to increased stratification. Now, when you look at the productivity from these Earth system models that have biogeochemistry enabled, there is much less consensus. A large portion of this globe here you can see is white, saying no change. That doesn't mean that they're collectively saying that nothing is going to happen. What that says is that models are disagreeing with each other, and that's why you get an average close to zero. And even in the sort of the worst case scenario, in the high emission scenario, I shouldn't say worst case, but the high emission scenario, you can actually see that there's disagreement in the models for the Bay of Bengal. And in fact, they are actually saying that the Bay of Bengal might get more productive in the future. You can see a little bit of green over there. So how do we reconcile these? That the monsoon is going to increase, so presumably you're going to have runoff increase and freshwater increase into the Bay of Bengal. But at the same time, these biogeochemistry Earth system models are saying that maybe there's even an increase in productivity in the future. So I'm going to make a case here that the way that we are trying to address this problem comes from the geological record. So the pivot that I'm going to make here is that the geological time periods can provide a rich laboratory for understanding how the Indian monsoon responds to climate forcing. So changes in CO2 or changes in multiple different Earth system parameters. If we know those changes, then we can figure out what the monsoon was doing if we are able to reconstruct the monsoon as well as its impacts. Now, we have a fairly good idea through the work of several decades of paleoclimatology and paleoceanography. So on this graph here is a x-axis that goes from 100 millions of years ago. This is in the Cretaceous period, all the way up to our modern Earth right here. Okay, so this is the modern, and this is basically 100 millions of years ago. And we have a fairly good understanding of how global temperatures changed over this time period. We know it was much hotter in the mid-Cretaceous, for example, and that across the Cenozoic, or the last 66 million years, where the continental configuration started to resemble what it looked like today, there was immense cooling, basically. There's a cooling trend. And we also know that the sort of the major knob on the climate system is greenhouse forcing associated with CO2, okay, shown by these reconstructions. Okay, so there's a lot of uncertainty still, but we have very good understanding, at least, of the relative changes between these different time periods across time. Now, this is a huge sort of geological picture. What I'm going to be focusing on this talk is relatively close to modern times. If you ask a geologist, they will say that the last glacial maximum is very recent in geological history, just about 20,000 years ago or so. Okay, so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. This is actually a cold period. Now, we know that this period is a time when the Earth was glaciated, the northern hemisphere was glaciated. So you can see here at the top, in this reconstruction here, that essentially sea level was, global sea level had fallen down by about 135 meters or so. India and Sri Lanka were connected, for example, and the Sunda and Sahul shelves were exposed because of the drop in sea level, which resulted from the building of these ice sheets, basically, in the northern hemisphere. So you can see these Laurentide and all of these other ice sheets in the northern hemisphere. This happened relatively recently in geological history, about 20,000 years ago. We still had not had human sort of societies or civilization. That comes later, about 10,000 years ago in the Holocene period, but this is before that. But what we're going to use this as a template is the last glacial maximum, when the Earth had ice sheets that were as large as they could get over the last million years or so. This period, up till the modern period, there is a pronounced global warming. So we want to use this global warming sort of period in geological history to try and understand what happens to the monsoon over this time period. So we are well aware of all of these boundary conditions that happened 20,000 years ago, and we can feed that into a climate model and also ask the climate model what the climate of the last glacial maximum was like. People have done this, and we have multiple models also basically simulating that. And the picture is such that the regional picture, not all the models agree, some models disagree, some models agree with themselves. But at the same time, that's where we are going to provide paleoclimate data to actually validate or to actually learn from those models in terms of what types of processes might explain our data. Now, how do we get our data? Our data in this talk is going to come from this little plankton. So you can see it's about 200 microns. And the plankton is known as a foraminifera. You can see this is a zooplankton, and it makes its shell from calcium carbonate. So even though it is a zooplankton, meaning that it is a heterotroph, it doesn't produce its own food, it doesn't photosynthesize by itself. However, it lives with a lot of symbiotic algae. So you can see here all of these dinoflagellates and diatoms that live, this sort of yellow flecks you can see here. They basically coexist with some of these planktic foraminifera. And these planktic foraminifera, they make these shells right here. They provide the other microbes living on them protection. But essentially, and they have these spines where these phytoplankton basically live on, the symbiotic phytoplankton. And the shell of foraminifera is made of calcium carbonate. And these calcium carbonate shells essentially fall down to the seafloor. These guys live for about 2 to 4 weeks, about a month lifespan. And then they fall down to the seafloor where geologists and paleoceanographers can go and collect these shells. Now, these are not the only type. The one that you see here, this one is known as a Trilobatus succulifer. That's the name given to it. But there's a whole host of characters of planktic foraminifera that exist in the oceans today, and a plethora of them that existed and went extinct going across geological history. So a lot of that knowledge of how the globe changed in its temperature come from these foraminifera. And you can see here they come in a variety of different sizes and shapes. And essentially, they live in different parts of the water column as well. And on top of that, different ones can live in different seasons. So if you have a good understanding of their ecology and their biology today, you can make some intelligent guesses about when they lived in the past and what they're representing in terms of their water column habitat and so on. But essentially, we query these foraminifera. These are our paleo CTDs that we go out and try to understand what the ocean temperatures and the ocean salinity and the oceanic conditions were going back millions of years. And so we basically collect marine sediment cores to try and understand what these foraminifera can tell us about the past oceans. So the way that these marine sediment cores are collected, many of you might be familiar with this, but essentially, we go out on ships and we can either core or drill sediments. And this is kind of what they look like. And the basic idea is that depending on the sedimentation rates in different parts of the ocean basin, the cores are going to represent some amount of time going down in depth. And each one of these clay-filled layers, these sediments, are rich with foraminifera in certain regions of the ocean. And if you go down in depth, you also go down in age. And so these sediments act as time machines that hold these tracers within them whose chemistry can ultimately tell us some things about the past oceanic content. So a lot of my days are filled looking at marine sediments that look like this. So one of the characters that we'll be talking about today is G. ruber, or Globigerinoides ruber. And this is, so we pick these shells based on their morphology, knowing their species and so on, looking at these cleaned up clay layers that look like sand like this. That's what we look at under the microscope and pick these shells, basically. They're calcium carbonate, and we can measure a lot of different things in them to try and understand different things about the ocean. Okay, and what we do is we tend to take these sediment cores and slice them up in a very sort of continuous fashion. And typically we take maybe 40 or 50 monospecific shells from the same species, crush them up together, and then get one measurement for that particular period. And that period might represent, decades in some parts of the oceans or millions of years in different parts of the oceans. But then we can go down core, as we call it, and get some understanding of how things change going back in time. We can also date these foraminifera to know when we are in time as well. So we can build these time series of past climate change. And the different types of proxies that we can apply are a variety of them. Today, I'm going to be talking about the oxygen isotope composition of the calcium carbonate that the shells are made out of. So again, like I said, typically people take 30 to 200 of these shells and they measure them by crushing them together and getting one measurement for one particular time period in the sediment core, and you go down core. Okay, so that one will represent an average of hundreds of years, for example. Now, on the flip side, one methodology that has become popular in the last 2 decades, and one that we employ in our laboratory, is individual foraminiferal analysis. So this basically measures single shells of these plankton. And if you measure multiple single shells from the same layer, because our technology is capable of doing that, we are able to get a population histogram of monthly variability within this time period. So the delta 18O is going to reflect a function of some temperature of the water mass that these forams are living in, as well as the oxygen isotope composition of the seawater, which is in turn related to the salinity of that seawater. So we can use this measurement to reconstruct the salinity and the temperature. Another measurement that we do is the magnesium to calcium ratio of the shells. And that is another proxy for the amount of temperature change that is happening while these guys are calcifying in the sea surface. Okay. Now let's go to our site here. Our site is in the Mahanadi Basin in the Northwest Bay of Bengal, where I showed you earlier. Today, this site experiences something about a 4 PSU, or practical salinity unit, change in the sea surface. It's an enormous change. And that, of course, happens in October when you have fresh water coming in from the monsoon. After the monsoon rains out, here's the monsoon right here in green that peaks from June to September. And then in October, you have a salinity minima. The temperature change at this site is about close to about 4 degrees or so in terms of the summer to winter changes. And we can measure the oxygen isotope composition of these shells, the magnesium to calcium ratios, and some function to go from the delta 18O of the seawater, which is our proxy for salinity, ultimately into how much monsoon runoff there was. So we are trying to reconstruct how saline or how fresh the Northwest Bay of Bengal was, that ultimately is getting modulated by the amount of Ganges-Brahmaputra runoff from the Indian margin. And so we've made some preliminary measurements on the core top, so the modernmost part of the sediment cores. And our reconstructed values are really spot on with the observed sea surface temperature. So we reconstructed 27.5, for example, plus or minus some 1 degree of uncertainty. That matches well. Same is the case with the salinity reconstruction at our site. So we feel pretty confident that we are getting the mean annual temperature and salinity at this location. Additionally, we can also measure the individual shells, and the individual shells faithfully capture the degree of seasonality of that runoff. So this runoff is also very seasonal. And so the seasonality of that runoff is directly relatable to the seasonality of monsoon rainfall on the subcontinent in the core monsoon zone as well. So these individual foraminifera, by tracking the salinity, can also tell us about the seasonality going back in time. Now, like I said, different foraminifera live at different parts of the water column. So here is the profile for that site. And so you can see here's the lower photic zone. Below this, light is not penetrating. The upper photic zone, where these foraminifera that live with the symbionts that are photosynthesizing for them. Then we have other foraminifera that don't have these same symbionts in the same density, for example, and they rely on other sources of food for surviving. And these guys here, the globorotalids, I'll talk about in a second, really rely on the chlorophyll maximum layer of organic production. So right here, about 80 meters or so in the Northwest Bay of Bengal is where you have the deep chlorophyll maximum. And these guys live slightly beneath it, and they subsist on the marine snow that rains out. So all of these creatures, the organic matter that's being produced in a healthy ocean, these guys exist on that. Now, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on two foraminifera. This one right here, G. ruber, and this one is T. sacculifer. So they live slightly deeper. They're both in the surface layer, but one lives slightly deeper than the other. The sacculifer lives slightly deeper than the ruber. But today they live in the same sort of mixed layer, and they experience the same conditions today. Okay, that's going to be important. And of course, you can see the majority of changes here are being driven by the salinity and not so much by the temperature when you look at the profiles. Now, other proxies that we're going to measure to try and track the production, how productive was the Bay of Bengal, we're again going to use trace elements in these foraminiferal shells. So one, we're going to use cadmium to calcium ratios. Cadmium is a micronutrient in the ocean, and the cadmium to calcium ratio that's incorporated in these forams, it scales with the amount of phosphate in that water column. So phosphate is a key nutrient that is required for healthy ecosystems and productive ecosystems. So we can track, based on the cadmium to calcium measurement, what the nutrient concentration was in the upper water column. We can also measure the uranium calcium ratios of the foraminifera, and these are a proxy for how much organic matter is ultimately preserved in the sediments. So this is in the deep sea sediments, in the sea floor, after the surface layer produces all of these creatures, and you have an ecosystem and recycling and remineralization and so on. Ultimately, what's preserved is the export productivity. So the uranium calcium ratios are a proxy for the export. And finally, we can also count the abundance of these particular types of foraminifera that live in the marine snow region. So they basically need the productivity to survive. And if you don't have a productive ocean, these guys are not going to survive. So we can count the number of species going back in time to get a good handle. And based on the relative agreement of all of these three different multi-proxy systems, we are going to make some statement about what productivity was during the Bay of Bengal from the last glacial maximum to present. Okay, so now gets into the results. Let me show you some results of our investigation. So I'm going to show you a lot of plots in the next slide that are time series reconstructions from the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago all the way to the modern era today. And what I'm going to show you are not the high resolution data. The high resolution data are basically century scale resolved or even better than that. So we have very high resolution data going back 20,000 years. Almost every 50 years, we have a data point. But what I'm going to be showing you for the sake of this talk are these smoothed versions of that to try and understand how monsoons change, how the Indian monsoon has changed on the time scale of centuries to millennia. Okay. And the one component that I have not yet talked about is that I was on this expedition to collect these sediments actually in 2014, November till January of 2015. We sailed for 2 months in the Bay of Bengal collecting these sediments along with other Indian scientists and world scientists across the globe. This was an image from the Bay of Bengal in the southern Bay of Bengal. This was somewhere close to Sri Lanka. And this little sort of yellow boat of fishermen came and tried to sell us some fish to the Joides resolution, which was an amusing time. So this is where that comes from. So I wanted to break the sort of the proxy explanations with some semblance of how this data was actually collected before I go into the time series, which I'm going to go into a second. Okay. So here come the results of our investigation. And this is unpublished. This is totally new stuff. It's currently in review. This is kind of fresh off the machines, so to say. So what we have here are the multiple different reconstructions from our site in the Northwest Bay of Bengal. The x-axis goes from 22,000 years ago all the way to the present right here. And I've highlighted 3 particular time periods known as the late Holocene, the early Holocene, when this was the start of the the advent of agriculture as we know it, and the HS1 period, which is known as the Heinrich Stadial 1. This is a time period when a large portion of the Laurentide ice sheet is thought to have broken off and fallen into the North Atlantic Ocean, disrupting sort of oceanic and atmospheric circulation across the planet. And so we're going to see how that actually impacted our site. Now, the different curves that I have here, here's a reconstruction of the sea surface temperature, the mean annual temperatures in the Bay of Bengal, Northwest Bay of Bengal. Here is our seawater delta 18O that has been corrected for some parameters that don't really take a precedence here. If someone's interested, I'm happy to go into the details. But this is essentially our proxy for monsoon runoff. Okay, so up is going to be increasing monsoon runoff, down is going to be reduced monsoon runoff. The green plot here is the Globorotalia counts. So how many of those Globorotalia species that live in the deep chlorophyll maximum or right beneath it, how many of those individuals that we found in terms of the percentage of the overall assemblage of all of the other planktic species. So up is going to be increased amount of particulate matter that these guys can survive and subsist on. At the bottom here, we have the 2 trace element ratios, the cadmium-calcium ratio, which is our proxy for nutrients. So the higher the cadmium-calcium content in the shells of the foraminifera, then the increased amount of nutrients in the upper ocean in the Bay of Bengal. And the uranium-calcium, which basically tells you the increasing amount of organic matter preservation in the sediments, how much productivity has been exported ultimately to the sediments. So what do we see? First off, we can see that it is much colder in the last glacial maximum compared to present by about maybe about 2 to 2.5 degrees, along with uncertainty. Okay, and we see that across the deglaciation, the Bay of Bengal warms with it's pretty uniform warming, except for this one particular time period of reverse cooling. This is a period known as the Younger Dryas. And then you have a resumption into the Holocene, you have a warming. In the Holocene, you see to have somewhat of a steady decline of temperatures, mean annual temperatures, but more so there's a lot of centennial scale variability. Remember, this is 10,000 years ago, this is modern right here. In terms of our monsoon proxy, we see that the monsoon also strengthens over the deglaciation in general. And over the Holocene, the monsoon remains kind of stable. Maybe it's declined over the Holocene, but there are definitely periods that punctuate this sort of stability with multi-centennial scale sort of droughts that you can see here. So these are sharp decreases in monsoon runoff that lead to increased salinity in the Northwest Bay of Bengal. Now, critically, we see that the lowest monsoon runoff or the highest salinities happens during this Heinrich Stadial 1 event. These are extremely low, and in fact, it's really amazing to think that these values are matching Bay of Bengal salinity and Delta 18 seawater values that are close to Sri Lanka today. That's how high the salinity was close to the mouth of the Ganges Brahmaputra about 60,000 years ago or so. Then you see that the monsoon increases, reduces again, and then ultimately reaches its highest that it's ever been in this time period, according to our proxy, in the early Holocene about 10,000 years ago. Okay, so this is a period that was dominated by changes in the Earth's orbit, conducive for more summer insolation. And so it's pretty well known that the monsoon might have intensified during this time. Okay, so this reconstruction, again, is consistent with previous several other reconstructions, but we provide a pretty high resolution monsoon reconstruction of the core monsoon runoff for the Holocene. Now, what are the productivity proxies telling us? Well, there are a lot of coherent changes that we can see across these not related proxies. These are completely independent of each other, and yet we see a lot of coherent changes across all of them. There's a little less coherence in the Holocene, but certainly when it comes to the deglaciation and the last glacial maximum, we can see that they're moving in concert. But what we see is very surprising to us. Initially, we were quite taken aback. We see that during the height of the monsoon, 10,000 years ago, the strongest monsoon runoff, as well as the weakest monsoon runoff, all our indicators suggest that productivity collapsed. We see that there is less nutrients to the upper ocean in the green. We see that there is decreased organic matter that's being exported to the sediments. We also see the lowest counts of our globorotalids. These are the species that are subsisting on that marine snow. And so we see that it's a seesaw, basically, that during both extremes, the production in the Bay of Bengal collapses. So how does this nonlinearity come about? That was what we were trying to understand. So we can see that the production collapses during both weak and strong monsoon states, which I'll have you note that the modern monsoon is middle to both of these states. It's not as extreme as it has been on either side, both in terms of how saline and how dry the subcontinent can get, but also in terms of how you can have almost seasonal flooding that has been reported during the early Holocene. So during these three periods that I've highlighted here, we also performed individual foraminiferal analysis that essentially measures the seasonality of salinity changes within those periods. So what did the seasonal cycle of salinity look like within these particular periods is what we wanted to try and find out. Okay, so this is what we see right here. These histograms basically describe individual shell measurements from these three different time periods, where the orange is the modern time period, the green is the early Holocene, and the purple is the Heinrich Stadial event when the monsoon was almost completely shut down. And we have performed this on two different species, one that lives at the topmost part of the water column and one that lives slightly below, where today their histograms of their oxygen isotope composition completely overlap each other. So the dashed orange line with the thick orange line are the two species, and they match each other very well. So we know that at least in the modern, independently, they are actually capturing what's going on in the topmost part of the water column. Now, during the early Holocene, we can see extremely negative values of this delta 18O measurement. This delta 18O is inversely correlated to salinity. So we can see that more negative means increased amount of low delta 18O river water that is coming into the Bay of Bengal. So again, independent from this bulk sort of measurement, the conventional way that we measure foraminifera, compared to the individual foraminiferal methodology, they seem to agree, and we see an extremely strong monsoon seasonality during this 10,000 during this period 10,000 years ago, and that is consistent with sort of extreme flooding happening every year, seasonal flooding that is consistent. This is what these foraminifera can tell us about. And furthermore, we see that both species are seeing that, which implies that the barrier layer dynamics was deep enough to affect both of these species as well, the changes associated. Now, on the other hand, we see that during the Heinrich stadial event, that there is a bifurcation between these two histograms coming from these two species. We've also shown in previous work that this might be sensitive to changes in the temperature, and we are basically suggesting that there is a thermal stratification during this Heinrich stadial event, whereas there is freshwater-based stratification during this strong monsoon runoff period. And so our hypothesis is that both of these periods encountered strong stratification. One was thermally driven, basically because of a complete lack of monsoon winds. So the entire coastal Bay of Bengal becomes like the open ocean where you don't have much seasonality and the water becomes stratified, versus the strong monsoon time period. These two are complete polar opposite realms for the Indian monsoon. And during this time, we are seeing an incredible amount of fresh water coming in, such that the barrier layer was no doubt much stronger than it is today. And that suppressed mixing and the sourcing of nutrients coming into the surface ocean. So both cases, there is stratification inhibiting mixing and not allowing for the nutrients to come into the surface ocean. But at the same time, the Heinrich stadial was due to thermal stratification, is our hypothesis, and the early Holocene strong monsoon event is due to freshwater input. Now, to sort of summarize my talk and to connect the past and the future, the way I'm going to do that is by showing you these isopycnal diagrams. So for those of you who may not be familiar, I'm sure many are, this is just a plot of temperature versus salinity of different water masses that people can look at in space to compare different processes that happen in the ocean related to mixing of different water masses. Isopycnals are lines of equivalent density of those water masses. Now, what I'm going to do is plot different time periods, but for the surface ocean, based on our reconstructions in the Northwest Bay of Bengal, what do these surface temperature salinity isopycnals look like? So here are our data. There's a lot of uncertainty and scatter in the data. Of course, this is geologic data that we're dealing with, but we're able to characterize those uncertainties pretty well. So these are different periods. This is the Heinrich stadial. Here's the early Holocene. This is the modern period. Here's the Bowling-Allerard period. Here's the last glacial maximum period. Okay, so they all lie in these particular configurations. Now, here is the modern observations that we go out and measure. They lie right over here for our site. And this is the modern sort of pre-industrial projections according to climate models. So it encompasses most of our modern data, the observations, but also some paleoclimate time periods in terms of its overall span. Okay, the early Holocene and the Heinrich stadial, I'll have you note, are beyond this. They're basically less dense than this 20 isopycnal layer right here, and more dense in the case of the Heinrich stadial event coming to this 22.5. So high density, low density here. Now, from our productivity reconstructions, we know that this is the optimal zone for optimal to high or modern to high productivity. And the last glacial maximum was one of the most productive time periods, according to our reconstructions, as well as other people's reconstructions in different parts of the ocean as well. Now, on the other hand, we can see that when production collapses, it's either if you move away from these isopycnals on either side. So the early Holocene, we have documented a production collapse, and the Heinrich stadial, we've documented a production collapse. Now, what is going to happen to the future? When we ask the future simulations where this is going to be for our site, the moderate emission scenario suggests that it is going to, the mean is at least going to cross this 20 isopycnal, but there is a lot of uncertainty in those models in terms of where the salinity actually might change. So that basically implies that We still might be in this realm of quote unquote natural variability to some extent in salinity space, but definitely not in temperature. We are going into a new normal when it comes to the temperature, according to these climate models. That's well outside the uncertainty, and that's what's causing this change in the density. The reduction in the density comes from the temperature change. Now, in the high emission scenario, we actually see that this is almost off the chart here, where the mean annual temperatures are projected to be at about 31 degrees C, according to a multi-model ensemble for the mean annual temperatures. And the salinities are also going to be reduced because of monsoon runoff, such that we are well outside this 20 isopycnal in the multi-model mean, as well as the uncertainty as well. So this basically does not bode well for future changes if you have an increasing monsoon or a highly variable monsoon, which can also lead to prolonged droughts, which some people have projected if there are quote unquote tipping points in the Earth system. So I'd like to conclude my talk by saying that the physical models are all showing that the monsoons are going to increase in India, across India, that the Indian monsoon is going to intensify in its seasonality. But yet there's a lot of uncertainty in the net primary productivity response according to these biogeochemical Earth system models. And in fact, they suggest that there's going to be an increase in production in the Bay of Bengal. Of course, that's not non-robust because the models are all disagreeing across the board, across their means. So our reconstruction suggests that the paleo record basically says that the marine productivity can collapse in the Bay of Bengal during both extreme Indian monsoon states of increases and strong monsoons, as well as during complete weak times as well. That has to do with changes in the wind. So essentially, this is basically our hypothesis that connects the past to the future and allows us to learn from the geological record about what might happen to the future. So I'm going to stop right here and I'll open this up for questions. I appreciate all of you for your time and thank you very much. If you're interested in this type of work or if you have any other questions, I'm happy to field them either by email or later on. So don't hesitate to contact me. You can find me on Twitter at holycow, holy_cow. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that talk, Dr. Kaustubh. We have one question on YouTube. Am I audible to you?
Yes.
Yeah, so there is Maitrai Gore who has asked that does the temperature affect collection of sedimentation and approximation of age of ocean layers?
Does the temperature affect that? Was that the question?
Yes. The temperature affect collection of sediment.
So that's a good question. The way that I'm going to answer that is it depends on the timescales of the sediments that you're looking at. So initially, when I showed you a plot of global temperatures over hundreds of millions of years, the global states on those sort of changes, they are going to affect things like productivity. They're going to affect things like changes in sort of circulation that are ultimately going to have an impact on preservation and amount of sedimentation rates. But at the same time, across, say, glacial interglacial changes, temperature of the globe or the water column is not going to be a first order control on the sedimentation in and of itself. So sedimentation rates change, but that's because there are changes in monsoon or runoff or other parameters basically, and not necessarily just the changes in the temperature per se. So it depends, but on short periods, relatively short, geologically short timescales, they don't have a first order impact.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. So there is another question by Dr. Manish Tiwari. He's asked, how come at the approximate 14K year ago that you refer to as the younger Dryas, a globally cooler period, you would have a higher monsoon? Is it the Bowling altered warming? Why is SST reduced during the BA warming in the Bay of Bengal?
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of 2-3 questions together.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to address that. So let me share my screen again. If one of you can tell me if you can see the screen, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and and thanks for that question, Manish. So the question is basically what's going on in this sort of Bowling-Alrod Younger Dryas region time period. And I haven't really demarcated those zones over here. And it's actually a very interesting observation that we tend to see some rather cooling or rather plateauing of the warming in the Bowling-Alrod, and we do see warming across the Younger Dryas. These are typically thought to be cool periods. We know that in other parts of the ocean, the SST is typically cool. But I'd like to point out that actually in the tropics, the warming across cold periods during the Heinrich stadial as well as during the Younger Dryas is actually quite well documented. And we have pretty good evidence, even in the Bay of Bengal as well as the Andaman Sea, that there is actual warming that is happening through the Younger Dryas as well. So the question, if you're asking me why exactly that happens, I can answer it by saying that it's well documented across the tropics. It's not just in our record. But the real reason is debate. It's up for debate to some extent. But people talk about, for example, changes in the intermediate waters that are affecting sort of ventilation in the tropics. That might be a driver of this, because it's anomalous in the tropics, and the subtropics and the pole regions, they cool during these events. But during the tropics, they actually warm. And another hypothesis has to do with just storage of heat and how heat moves around relative to ocean circulation as well. So there are different hypotheses across the board, but this warming, which is relatively minor across the board in our reconstruction, is pretty consistent with other reconstructions as well. And the other reason for the plateau in the bowling alley rod might actually be due to the resumption of the monsoon, such that you actually have fresh water that's coming in that might also additionally tend to halt the warming that's happening. So if you have fresh, cool water coming into the oceanic realm from the terrestrial record, that also might additionally cause a delayed warming during the bowling alley rod, for example.
Okay, thank you so much. There's one more question by Fanindra Reddy. They've mentioned it is surprised to see that the last glacial maximum productivity value is falling in the group or late Holocene and BA, etc. So perhaps if you could comment on that. Why would it be so? They followed up. Why would it be so?
Yeah, this is a good question as to why there might be these coupling or grouping of production when it comes to these cold and alternatively warm periods. And the reason is our hypothesis, and I can show you a little bit more in detail here in a second, but our hypothesis is that the control of production in this regime is not necessarily just one thing. It's not just increased monsoon runoff or lack of winds. As we know, that has come from a lot of oceanographic work in India. There are multiple controls on production in the Bay of Bengal. And barrier layer is one of the ways in which reductions in mixing can be observed. Now, that said, there can be increases in production due to, say, for example, remote forcing of eddy pumping, for example. Now, during the last glacial maximum, we think that there was heightened climate variability in the equatorial Indian Ocean. We also know, for example, that the winds themselves are actually stronger in spite of the reduced thermodynamic constraint of how much moisture they could hold. So that said, increased winds lead to increased mixing, and increased equatorial ocean energetics would also lead to increased eddy pumping. So that's our hypothesis as to why the LGM is a productive time period. Now, on the other hand, the bowling alley rod in the late Holocene, they're warm periods opposite to the LGM, but these are time periods when the monsoon is not that strong, such that there is still actually a feasible barrier layer that mixing can overcome, as opposed to the ultimately stronger monsoon runoff periods like the early Holocene. At the same time, the monsoon is strong enough such that you still have strong winds that are leading to mixing as well as having runoff come through. So it's sort of in the intermediate zones there. That's the reason why they all clump together in this sort of grouping. Now, I could have cut off this circle right here because the LGM indeed is a higher productivity regime than all of these other periods. But at the same time, I wanted to highlight that this is sort of the physical oceanographic viewpoint into when we reconstruct optimal or modern to high productivity. And these are the regions outside of it. So that's the real reason. It's this sort of multi-parameter response that's not just dependent on cold period temperature or weak monsoon or strong monsoon. It's a coupling of multiple different things that gives rise to this nonlinearity.
Okay, thank you so much. So I don't see any more questions on YouTube. I have a question, if that's okay. Anyone else wants to go before me?
Yeah,
Yes,
I
So
have
maybe
a couple
Bhupendra can go
of
and go next.
questions. Yeah, so I'm not expert in this field, but Kaustav, really excellent talk. I enjoyed it. So I
Thank you.
have a couple of very basic questions. So in one of your slides, I could see that prior to this early Holocene period, there was a recovery in monsoon. So, but at that time, you don't see any dip in the productivity or something, right? Can you show that slide? So,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, so where is the critical limit or the cutoff that, okay, so if the monsoon, strengthens by this much amount or it,
Sure.
yeah, so that I wanted to know this thing. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so Bhupendra's question is a good one. Again, talking about, so, we see that the monsoon resumes here during the bowling
Yes.
Allarod. And in spite of its resumption and a strong monsoon, that we still don't see a productivity collapse like we see in the early Holocene. Okay. And the reason for that is, again, it has to do with the combination of temperature as well as salinity. But really, the key is winds here. So our hypothesis is that even though there was a strong monsoon relative to the glacial times in the bowling Allarod, the strength of the monsoon was not strong enough in terms of the monsoon rainfall in order to have this strong freshwater plume that creates a quasi-permanent barrier layer that inhibits mixing. So we can see that quantitatively, our value for the bowling Allarod is somewhere minus 0.2, which is corresponding to a little less reduced time than even the modern. So you can think of the bowling Allarod monsoon as still being a little less than today, slightly more saline, or equivalent. Within uncertainty, of course, we are restricted in terms of how much we can actually make inferences. But it's safe to say that it's somewhat similar to today. So that's why it falls under this high productivity regime, or I shouldn't say high, but moderate, at least similar or comparable to the modern regime. But during the early Holocene, the increase in the monsoon runoff is not able to counteract how strong the winds are required. So if you have enough rainfall, even if you have more winds, those winds are not strong enough to break the barrier layer to have that mixing. So it's this tug of war between the amount of runoff coming from the monsoon versus how much wind mixing you have or energetics that are producing eddies from the pycnocline that can break the barrier layer and provide nutrients up to the surface ocean. And on the other hand, we should remember that rivers also bring nutrients, but there are plenty of studies that show in the Bay of Bengal that majority of the river nutrients are consumed in the shallow delta regions. They don't make their way out into sort of the coastal plume as well. So that might be another reason that you are having sort of some of these varied responses in the Holocene as well. But we can see that production increases. You see the number of species goes up when the monsoon goes up as well. And that reason, again, is going to be related to the interplay between how strong the winds are that produces a monsoon and that can still break the barrier layer.
Yeah, and my another question was, so you have showed model projections. So in one of your slides, I could see that in high emission scenario, most of the models agree kind of increased productivity over the Southern Ocean. So what could be the possible? Yeah, this bottom panel,
Sure.
last one.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would refer you to Kwiatkowski et al. For the full details on this. But let me try to address that aspect, even though it's not my expertise. But essentially, you have to understand that these, and there are many Earth system modelers at IITM and in India, of course, working on this problem. But that said, Earth system models that have biogeochemistry enabled in them are in their very nascent phase still. So there's a long way to go. We've come a lot further when it comes to the physical models and the sort of the physical couplings as opposed to biology. Biology is always difficult to predict and to constrain. Now, that said, one plausible reason for this increased production in the Southern Ocean might arise from the increased Antarctic circumpolar current. And there are sort of debates in terms of what these models are actually are actually simulating and whether that's the right way. Remember, the models can agree for the wrong reasons as well. Okay, so I would take this with a grain of salt because, and no pun intended, even though I'm talking about salinity, but take this result with a grain of salt because these are heavily parameterized models. that might agree for the wrong reasons. But that said, they are generating sort of a robust increase. So there's probably a signal there that I direct you to the paper to look into. But my guess is that it would be related to changes in the ocean atmospheric setting in the Southern Ocean and how those are related to currents and upwelling that is going to result in more nutrients to the surface ocean.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have one question from YouTube, again from Maitreyi. What are the challenges we might face due to severe climate change in Holocene epoch, and is it worse than the earlier eras?
Well, we are still in the Holocene epoch right now, and the geologists who make these types of decisions have refused to say that the Anthropocene is its own geological era. That's a lot of debate for good and bad reasons, but there's a debate still, and it's not officially been sanctioned. So we're still currently in the Holocene. So to answer your question, the challenges we face due to severe climate change in the Holocene is our current challenge right now of anthropogenic climate change, of increased CO2. So that's one of the major severe climate change issues of our time, as a species. But is it worse than earlier eras? Well, what we've shown is that the monsoon response to climate change is actually, we are in the kind of a medial state. It's kind of interesting to think about that. The last 7,000 years of kind of civilization that has been built in the Indian subcontinent, a large part of it was probably subsisting on oceanic production and productivity, was built in medial conditions compared to geological extremes. Okay, so we have shown that the paleoclimate record shows much more severe climate changes and impacts than what is faced right now at this time. But that said, we are heading into a really bizarre era, considering how much forcing we're actually putting in. There's no question that the rate of change in the forcing is unprecedented across many millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. So in that sense, I should say millions of years for sure. Some geologists would debate me about 100 millions of years, rightfully so probably, but definitely in terms of the rate of change, we are soon going to move into a new normal. So that is certainly going to be a challenge that's going to that we are collectively facing as a society and as humanity.
Thank you. So there's one more question by Tina Tulsi. As you mentioned, you by CA ratio on describing the preservation of organic matter. Does it provide the source of sedimentation?
Yeah, that is a very good question, and I have a slide hopefully prepared to address that. I thought I did at least, but let me go back here and I'll show you how this proxy tends to work. So hopefully you can see my screen here, and so this middle plot is what I'd like to direct your attention to. So essentially we have here, this is from previous studies. I forgot to put the citation, but this is Carey Lear et al. 2016. This comes from a paper by some Swiss authors in 2008. But essentially what you can see here is planktic uranium calcium.
Kaustubh, we are unable to see your screen. Yeah.
Oh, is that so? Sorry about that. Let me share again. Is this visible now?
Yes. It is visible now.
Okay. Yeah, so what I'd like to show you is the center plot. So you can see this is previous work where they've shown that uranium calcium in planktic forams actually tracks the benthic carbon isotopes of benthic forams. Basically, these are forams that live at the bottom of the ocean. These are planktic forams, like I talked about, that live at the top of the ocean water column. And you can see that they track each other. This is a proxy for how the water masses and the respiration of these sediments is changing in the seafloor. And that is tracked by the uranium calcium. Same is the case over here. You can see the bulk sediment uranium calcium matches really nicely with the foraminiferal uranium calcium. So the signal of the uranium, essentially that's in the sediments, uranium gets released when you actually tend to have more amount of remineralization of these sediments. So essentially the lesser amount of organic matter that's coming down the less remineralization that you have. And the less remineralization that you have, the redox state changes such that uranium is not mobile anymore in order to get glomped onto the shells of the foraminifera in the sediments. So this is an orthogenic proxy, a post-depositional proxy. It happens after the foram is dead and falls to the sea floor. If there's amount of organic matter that's coming in, that's basically going to get respired, and you basically make the uranium more mobile from the sediments into that pore water column where the foram shells are. And then there is a coating of uranium on these foramiferal shells during periods when there's high organic matter. If there's no organic matter that's coming, then you actually have very low uranium. And that's what these previous studies are basically showing us. And ultimately, our study kind of shows that the uranium concentration is ultimately being tracked along with the cadmium concentrations as well. The cadmium is a proxy for the surface ocean, the uranium for the bottom waters and the sediments. And so the fact that these two are agreeing completely different proxies, at least in these two time periods, gives us confidence that production is what is driving these concurrently, and nutrients in this case. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I think Supriyo sir has had his hand raised for a while, so maybe you can go next.
Very nice talk,
Yes,
sir.
please.
And in this respect, I like to have a couple of questions. See, first
Please.
question is that once you interpret about the seasonality based on the distribution of delta ethno distributions of two different these individuals. So, but your distribution, I think it is based on this number of, it depends on the number of individual forums, which maximum frequency gives about 10 to 20. So, how robust it is statistically?
Excellent question. Yeah, that's a very good question, and something that we've paid a lot of attention to when it comes to sort of statistical modeling of these foraminifera and how many foraminifera you might need to get the right answer, quote unquote. So there are a couple of ways that we've handled this. One way is to actually use forward models. So essentially, you take modern observations of oxygen isotopes of seawater and temperature, and hypothetically calculate what foraminiferal delta 8 would look like if you fed those data into some transfer equations, for example. Now, if we take those, then we get a distribution of what the modern hypothetical calcification delta 8 values ought to be of these foraminifera. Now, what we can then do is play some Monte Carlo simulations with them and say, okay, let me randomly pick just 3 months. Assuming that a foram represents a month within that time series, what type of answer do we get? Can we pick 5? Can we pick 6? And keep doing this multiple times so we can get a distribution of the number of picks that is required to get a robust estimate. So in our location, because of the high seasonal cycle here, this is one of the largest seasonal cycles on the planet in terms of delta 8 seawater and temperature combined, we actually can very robustly estimate seasonality even with small number of forams. Now, of course, on the other hand, the other parameter that matters here is the sedimentation rate. How many forams are you representing within the time represented by the sedimentation rate, especially when you have bioturbation, mixing of these sediments, and so on. So if your sediments are 2,000 years, that one sample you're trying to build 2,000 years, then you're probably out of luck if you have only 30, 40 forams. You'll need some 180 forams to get a robust signal. In our case, because we have sediments that are resolved to about 50 years, very short time period, and we actually use about 80 forams across species. So total, we are taking about 160 forams, individuals. We actually get a very robust population estimate. So they match with the forward model observations, telling us that they grow during the entire seasonal cycle. And B, there are enough numbers that tell us that we can get a reproducible signal, because what we can then do is sub-select even from our data and see how much data that we need within individual shells to get that robust signature. So we've done all of these analysis for our particular site. We've actually written a paper in Current Science, published in 2020. It was in R. Ramesh's special issue dedicated to him. So I can send you that paper if you'd like to take a look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's very nice answer. And I'll have another question. That is, see, there is a recent study led by the IISc group. They have done paleo modeling simulation of monsoon, and what they propose is that the monsoon strength based on the this proxies, what is derived, which is basically relies on the monsoon current, this monsoon circulation, and basically the intensity of the low level jet. But what they propose is that this monsoon strength may not be derived from this intensity of the low level jet, because this low level jet itself varies. It may vary its latitudinal position as well as spatial extent, and that is driven not necessarily by the monsoon intensity, but it is basically the response between the thermodynamic response of atmosphere, ocean and atmosphere, basically the latent heat exchange. So how do you reconcile these things? Because when you derive this based on this, for example, cadmium calcium ratio, it represents the upwelling, and which you assume that when monsoon is strong, the upwelling is also strong. So based on these new results, how do you reconcile these proxy results and the model simulation?
Yeah, okay, excellent question. So Supriyaji brings up Jalihal's papers, basically Chetan's papers on a series of papers on the orbital forcing of the monsoon. So there are two things. One, let me clarify by saying I'm not saying that this is upwelling. We know that upwelling doesn't necessarily take place in the Bay of Bengal in the way that we think about upwelling in the Arabian Sea, for example. So this is not necessarily upwelling. So sourcing of nutrients can happen through eddy pumping that doesn't necessarily require upwelling. So A, the cadmium calcium can reflect just the nutrient composition. Now B, when it comes to those papers, what they're talking about is not in the Bay of Bengal. They're talking about Arabian Sea upwelling proxies off the Oman margin. Right. And they're basically saying that the low latitude jet can change in its position, both the Somali jet as well as the associated oceanographic current can change independent of monsoon rainfall amount on top of subcontinent, for example, the core monsoon zone. Now, that said, that has more implications, not to us, but to several reconstructions that have come from the Arabian Sea. And I think it's an important point. Now, that said, one of the shortcomings of their approach is that they are using equilibrium simulations. Even when you use transient simulations, which they've done using CESM, the issue becomes that you are not necessarily resolving the sort of the tight coupling that is coming from the ocean atmospheric regions over the Arabian Sea. There are classical biases in CSM associated with that to some extent. Now, even if you buy those, the problem then also becomes how you want to compare these across changes in the Pleistocene, because that's ultimately what they're focusing on in terms of latent heat changes and so on, is multiple glacial interglacial cycles, not just necessarily deglacial LGM to present, even though one of their papers was focused on that. And I'm simply not convinced that the CESM orbital response is accurate. And why I'm not convinced is it disagrees with the best existing data in terms of the orbital response of the Bay of Bengal. So the model classically generates an anti-phasing with amount of rainfall over the Bay of Bengal versus what is happening on the continent. And in that case, given this sort of decoupling, we don't necessarily see that, because we see consistency across the proxy records in the Andaman Sea, in the Bay of Bengal, in the Arabian Sea. They're timed to the same extent in terms of their lags and their delays and their phasing, that it's too much of a coincidence in order to say that just one was affected in a different way. So I'm not really sure that that the mechanism that is put forth by those authors considering that model necessarily works for the Somali jet in that same way. But even if you believe that, even if those proxies are biased, well, we have completely independent proxies in the Bay of Bengal that are talking about the monsoon in a much more straightforward runoff perspective that is not affected by upwelling changes or latitudinal shifts of the Somali jet. This is just runoff from the Ganges Brahmaputra, something we can depend on year in, year out, going back millennia. So this is a physical reproduction of that. And those data agree with those Arabian Sea data. That's where my skepticism of the mechanism comes in. But that said, I think those are very important studies, because we want to question the simple idea that has existed for the last 20 years that is based on speleothems in Oman or China, for example, that the monsoon simply responds 1:1 with changes in insolation. I think we have a lot of evidence to say that that's not necessarily the case. It's very nice to see modeling studies that also say that different feedbacks are at play here, and it's not simply just changes in sort of insolation that are causing these changes that we observe in the monsoon.
Right, right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaustubh. I have one sort of a layman question because I'm a very new person to this entire argument. Just when you were discussing, if you take samples from Arabian Sea versus the samples from say Bay of Bengal, we have a very large spatiotemporal variability within the monsoon itself. So, the Arabian Sea branch, which brings monsoon to the west coast versus the Bay of Bengal branch, which brings monsoon to the east coast, that in itself has a different variability. So, I was wondering, has there been any study which sort of compares these samples on a long-term time scale? And is there a signature of that spatial variability also present in those samples? I mean, is there such a thing even possible? And would it yield any kind of sort of a sort of a glimpse into how variable monsoon was in terms of its spatial characteristics back a few hundred years 100,000 years ago perhaps? Is that possible?
Yeah, no, that's actually a very good question. Not at all a layman question at all. And even if it was, all questions are welcome. But the question is, can we, obviously there are changes, there's differences in the amount of rainfall depending on where you are in the subcontinent. And if you're getting sourced from Arabian Sea moisture or Bay of Bengal moisture, you have, season to season, day to day, year to year differences. Now, that said, one of the hopes of the paleoclimate is that these are largely equilibrated climates that you'd think that the responses across the domain are the same. But in fact, we are seeing that that's not necessarily the case, even across the time periods that we see. So I didn't show this in the talk that I gave, but we have, for example, several speleothem reconstructions that in and of themselves all seem to disagree. Up is stronger monsoon, down is weaker monsoon. That's inferred at least. And you can basically see here that across the deglaciation, they seem to agree, at least this green and yellow seem to agree in terms of their swings to some extent and this intensification. But once you're in the Holocene, there's a lot of variability from region to region according to these continental reconstructions. Now, our Bay of Bengal reconstruction of salinity, this is what that is, the same plot that I showed you before. Here we're comparing it to modern observations. So you can see that our core top does a good job of replicating modern observations. But we see that this reconstruction doesn't necessarily look like any of these reconstructions. There's a lot more coherence in the deglaciation. We see some similar changes. But in the Holocene, we do see some similarities where there's intensified early Holocene in some of these reconstructions, but not the others. There's also, for example, a decline over the last 4,000, 3,000 years that we also observe right here. And there are some events like this 4,000 years ago, there's these anomalies in this stalagmite reconstruction from the northeast of India that also is there in our salinity reconstruction. But we are arguing that our record integrates the core monsoon runoff. All of this runoff ultimately has to go down to our site. Whereas these other sort of site-based proxies can reflect some of that regional spatial variability, even across these long time periods as well. Now, what I'd like to also show you, because you asked about the Arabian Sea, are reconstructions that come from, this is a paper by Rajiv Saraswat and others from NIO. And they're trying to reconstruct runoff from the Western Ghats and salinity from the Western Ghats, ultimately to try and look at the monsoon. And we can see that there is somewhat of some coherence in the deglaciation between these records, at least during this so-called Heinrich event and during the Bowling Alley, although they don't necessarily see a strong younger dryas, although there is dating uncertainties here. These triangles represent where we have age control points. But certainly across the Holocene, we can see that the trends are itself different between these two reconstructions. And so this actually shows a freshening trend at this site, whereas we see a more of a salinification trend at this site. And so whereas this might arise from the fact that maybe something is wrong with our reconstruction and we're not really recording just pure monsoon runoff, or at the same time, they may not be reconstructing Western Ghats runoff because they're in a more sort of open ocean site, not necessarily on the margin in the way that we are, along with the riverine outflow, that you can have changes in ocean salinity that are decoupled from the monsoon. But if you believe both are runoff, then these trends are telling us that there is spatiotemporal variability on long timescales within the Holocene, at least, where climate forcing was relatively muted compared to the glacial time periods, and definitely compared to the glacial time periods. So when the forcing is maybe small, then you might have large spatial variability in the monsoon signal as well. So we see this spatial variability being reflected across these multiple proxies. And I've only used the proxies here that are either well resolved and are long enough to actually be compared to our record on these timescales. So amongst these speleothems and marine sediment cores. So I hope that answers your question. Basically, that there is observable changes, and in fact, the so-called insulation control on the monsoon that has been invoked in East Asia and in Omani speleothems. Actually, when you look at the Indian speleothems, these sites have been used to say something about the South Asian or Indian monsoon, but the picture is quite different when you look at proxies from the ground in India and when you look at our reconstruction that integrates rainfall and runoff in the core monsoon zone.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I did answer my question. We have two more questions if you're game for it.
Yes, please. Yeah, no problem.
So there's Maitre Gore who's asked, when the sedimentation in Bay of Bengal is transported to the Southern Ocean, that is Antarctica, due to ocean currents, does it affect the salinity or nutrient content in the Bay of Bengal region? And how does it affect marine ecosystem?
So the sediments that are ultimately coming, that the rivers are transporting and getting into the Bay of Bengal, it's no joke, because the Bengal fan that is created by these sediments is the largest fan on the planet today, riverine delta fan offshore. So it's a huge amount of sediment that's being taken into the Bay of Bengal. And I'm not a sedimentologist, nor is my expertise in terms of sediments in the marine realm that are sort of terrestrial sediments at least, or riverine sediments. But I'm not so sure that a lot of sediment ultimately makes its way into the Antarctic, for example, or Southern Ocean, in terms of direct lithogenic sediments, for example. And so I don't think there is much of an impact on the Southern Ocean from sediments on these timescales, definitely not. But that said, their effect on the salinity is minimal. The sediments themselves don't necessarily change the salinity of the water masses, although they do bring in, they change the alkalinity. They don't necessarily have a huge impact. The sediments themselves don't have an impact on the salinity. The fresh water does even more. And the fresh water and the salinity, the fresh water brings in nutrients, but the sediments can act as ballast. And people have actually invoked the ballast mechanism as a way in which oceanic productivity ultimately makes its way down to the seafloor in the Bay of Bengal. So that it can have a huge impact in terms of providing ballasting sort of centers for nucleation for organic matter to actually form on or accumulate on and ultimately go down. These lithogenic sediments can have an impact on. But it by themselves don't necessarily affect the productivity. And again, the river water that's bringing in the nutrients, they are largely consumed in the deltas or in the shelves before it makes it out into the open ocean. So that doesn't have an effect. But the sediments can have an effect through their ballasting effect ultimately.
Okay, wonderful. There's one last question. I think it was related to the monsoon question which I asked. Fanendra Reddy has asked, are you able to address the approximately 6K year anomalies?
Yeah, that's a really good and sort of a pertinent observation from Fanendra. So basically, I think he's talking about this anomaly that we see here, sort of a punctuated high salinity event, I should say, that is likely indicative of drought-like conditions in the monsoon domain. And to be very honest with you, we really haven't scrutinized the Holocene changes as much because in this study we are focusing on those monsoon extremes. But that said, there is some interesting correspondences to changes in the North Atlantic that may be related to ice rafting events in the North Atlantic that might be a potential cause. On the other hand, there might be changes associated in El Nino that might be having a sort of a pronounced sort of centennial scale impact. But on the same time, we do want to note that there is kind of this abrupt change, right? So for a large period of the time, we seem to have stable conditions here for about 1,000 years or so. And so the equilibrium conditions for the mid-Holocene might actually reflect sort of stronger monsoons. So if you extrapolate the 6,000 year values, they come up to be slightly more negative than the modern observed values, indicative of a stronger monsoon. So if you look at mid-Holocene simulations of the Indian monsoon, they show increased monsoon simulations just in general. I haven't scrutinized that. But this anomaly right here might be related to something else that's a millennial scale anomaly, and that's not necessarily just indicative of overall mid-Holocene conditions. And the interesting thing here is that this is also seems to be equivalent or larger than this anomaly that we see, this other much larger anomaly or a prolonged anomaly that we see that's indicative of high salinity conditions in the Northwest Bay of Bengal, indicative with the sort of subsequent droughts in the Indian monsoon. And interestingly enough, for those of you who may be aware, this is also the time that we see the change in the Harappan civilization going from the sort of mature to the late phase, where ultimately the Harappan civilization declined. So that's an interesting coincidence at this time period. So going back, there might be some correspondence with North Atlantic events for this anomaly. But the equilibrium response to me seems to be more consistent with heightened monsoon runoff.
All right. Thank you so much. So I think there was one last comment from Fanindra who said, we have speleotherm records from Central India showing an event at approximately 6.3 K a year and trying to understand the signal origination. I think it was just a comment they made. But I believe we've come to the end of the talk, unless you have anything to say about the comment.
Well, one interesting thing I'd like to point out, again, this is a speleotherm record from Kutumsar, published by Shraddha Band and others at PRL. But there's actually an interesting sort of anti-correlation that we see between, if you assume that the amount effect is what is controlling the monsoon, the delta 18 of these speleotherms, that more negative is more rainfall and less negative is less rainfall. You kind of see this U-shaped curve from the Central Indian record that seems to be opposite to our monsoon reconstruction during that same time period. But this actually might be indicative of some interesting spatiotemporal dynamics of the monsoon on these sort of multi-centennial timescales. We know for a fact that there are differences in the spatial variability of the monsoons when you go on these sort of multi-centennial millennial timescales with other speleotherm records. So I would suggest to you to look into where in this region it is, how does it actually compare with these other reconstructions. And if you look here closely, there does seem to be an anomaly in this speleotherm record that definitely is juxtaposed on ours here as well. So there might be some differences in the long-term changes versus the sort of the punctuated changes. So I'm happy to share our data if you want to take a look at how it looks like compared to what we are considering is the drainage of monsoon rainfall all across this region right here. So I'll just stop right there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kaustubh, and thank you for being very patient with our questions. I know it's late over there. So I'll request Bhupendra Singh to propose the vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Aditi. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Bhupendra Bahadur Singh from Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology. It is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Ocean Society of India Pune chapter and acknowledge the contribution of each and everyone who worked really hard to make this event a success. So first of all, I would like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Kaustubh Thirumalai, Assistant Professor, Department of Geosciences, University of Arizona. Without any hesitation, he agreed to deliver a talk on the OSI Pune chapter platform on the occasion of World Ocean Day 2022. In very simple words, he explained how plantic foraminiferal shells retrieved from seafloor sediments can be used to reveal several lines of information about the history of Earth's climate. He gave quite relevant information on how the hidden information in foraminiferal shells can be used to reconstruct century-scale temperature and hydrographic fluctuations that are related to Indian paleo-monsoon variability since the last ice age. I believe that such informative talk would have generated a lot of interest in the research community. In fact, that is visible from the questions which were put on the YouTube live channel. I thank him once again on my personal behalf and also on the behalf of organizing committee of the OSI Pune chapter. I also extend my sincere thanks to the director IITM Pune and the main committee of the OSI for granting the infrastructure, facilities, and all the required support at various stages. Our thanks are also due to the audience for participating in this event. We further expect your cooperation in our future endeavors. I herewith give a special mention of the organizing committee comprising of Dr. Supriyo Chakravarti, Dr. Jasti Chaudhary, Dr. Hamza Varikoden, Dr. Abhilash Panikar, Dr. Aditi Deshpande, and Dr. Aditi Modi. Many thanks to them for their sincere work right from the planning to the execution of this event. Once again, I would like to thank all of you for making this event successful with your contribution and blessings. Now, I would like to officially end this event with your permission. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.